Weep none for the memory.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. So moving. I want to talk about memory. It's really about memory. I want to talk a little bit about personal memory, and then I want to talk about sort of our social, almost national memory as well. And just like the song says, it's about not fearing those memories. It's really, memory is so important to our own healing, our own health, our own humanity. And so I want to talk about that. I want to start by talking a little bit on a personal level about memory, and then I want to move into this more social idea of the importance of memory and the legacy that comes with it. So it began last time I was here, speaking at the point a couple weeks ago. I mentioned that it was the anniversary of when my daughter Sienna had died. It was the 9-year anniversary. And so I was very emotional, as those of you who are here can remember. So I said I didn't want to talk about it that day, but I did want to come back around to talk about it because our theme this month at All Souls is transcendence. And I wanted to talk about how do we transcend loss? How do we move from loss into life again? And a lot of times people think of transcending loss as sort of get over it or as if you're going to sort of fly above it, but that's not at all what I'm saying. It's the only way out of loss is through. The only way out is through. You have to go through it. And so I wanted to talk about that. It's really moving to have Rick and Tavis sing because they sang at my daughter's memorial service, which we held here at the church, and I mean with that kind of support. And you know, I see Pat and Jane here and so many others who were such a part of the team that just held me in this congregation during that time in my family. And what I was recalling a couple weeks ago was how we had such a joyous time celebrating Sienna this year. And we put pink lemonade into champagne glasses and toasted her, and we just really played games and enjoyed ourselves. And what it reminded me of was the time when I thought we would never feel joy again in our household. When I wondered whether it would ever lift that deep, dark sadness that was over our lives at the time. And so it was such a contrast to think about how we could remember her. We still feel the sadness, but in such a joyful way. And there's so much laughter and dancing and stuff in our house today that it just reminded me that I should probably speak a little bit about this because many of us deal with death and loss, and all of us are going to if we haven't already. So I wanted to talk about that today. And, you know, some of the things I wanted to talk about was a metaphor that really helped me to get through this. And I mentioned it once before years ago, and I want to bring it back up today because I think it makes a difference. And it was, the reason that metaphors and images are so important is that the mind, the cognitive, rational mind can't really heal us from deep, deep grief and emotional pain. And so sometimes it's just an image or the imagination or something like that that really can help us to break free and really begin to heal. And so this was an image that involved 3 horses, a red horse, a white horse, and a black horse. And each one represents a stage of, you could call it an initiation of some sort, into our maturity, into our adulthood, into our wisdom and compassion, into being an elder of a community. And you have to ride each one of these horses, was the idea, in order to arrive at your full humanity. And so the first horse, actually they don't go in order. It would be nice if they always did, but they don't. But but if they did, the one that would ideally come first would be the red horse. The red horse represents risk-taking and playfulness and boundary testing and all that kind of those things in our lives that involve really some danger and testing ourselves. So when we're young, we do all kinds of crazy things. We drive too fast, we drink too much, we test and we try and we do things that maybe break the law sometimes. and we are just pushing, and playing, right? And that's the red horse. And the red horse, there's a part of us that needs to come alive. It's the Tom Sawyer that's within every one of us, that when our aunt is yelling to get on our nice clothes and come to church, we just want to run down to the river and smoke a pipe with Huck Finn and just swear and spit and do all that kind of stuff. And some people don't in their young years because they were brought up in a certain religious background or a certain kind of family. They don't welcome that part of themselves. They don't find an outlet for it as a young person. And that can be a little problematic later on. So I'll get to that in a second. But let's just imagine that you ride that red horse as a young person. And I won't make you raise your hands, but those of us who have, we did some crazy things we might not want to admit. Then the white horse is that part of us that is the white horse of community and responsibility. It's that time when you finally say, I'm ready to take a job, volunteer, maybe get married, start a family. Now you have people counting on you to be responsible. Can I show up when I need to? Can I show up when it's hard? Can people count on me? And can I be responsible? And so there's a sort of a period in our lives where we really, for somebody to be fully formed as a human being in community, they need to know how to ride that white horse. So one of the problems that happens is if you're riding the white horse, you have a lot of people counting on you. And then if you haven't had that red horse initiation, and all of a sudden that part of yourself starts saying, I want to be alive, I want to feel this part, it can be a little dangerous. This is the stuff of midlife crises. And actually, men particularly, but not exclusively, will sometimes get a red car, a Mustang convertible or whatever, and start to grow their hair long and pierce their ears and do whatever to just begin to try to and cross boundaries on their relationships and in other ways in their lives, and sometimes blow up their families and their careers and other kinds of things. So it's a little dangerous when you haven't had that part of yourself awakened, and then all of a sudden it starts to come alive. Now, there are ways for people to have a healthy red horse riding experience even after they are a part of a family and a career, and do that in a way that doesn't destroy their lives. And that usually involves finding other outlets for that kind of thing, like people will start mountain biking or rock climbing or whitewater kayaking, or who knows, all kinds of things that people might do that sort of allow that part, maybe take a painting class or something to begin to let that more playful, childish part of us come alive without destroying our families, which is good. But you have to know what your heart and soul are longing for in those moments. Otherwise, it's easy to get confused. Then the black horse is the horse that represents death and sorrow and loss. It's the baptism of tears, if you will, that every human being has to go through at some point when somebody we love dies or is going to die. And when we're on that black horse ride is, and man, I know I'm looking around, I know many of us have experienced it. It's so painful, it's so bumpy, it's so rocky, it's so unwieldy that it's hard to stay on. And this metaphor helped me realize I needed to stay on the black horse if I was going to, there was a reason, and then I could do it because I knew there was a reason. I was actually being initiated into my full humanity. I need to stay on it. When I wanted to jump off, and it's tempting. You just want to come up for air sometimes. I just want to have some joy, whether it's through drinking or drugs or an illicit relationship or whatever. It's like, I just want to have some fun because coming home is absolutely no fun. And what I'm feeling in my heart is absolutely too painful to bear. So we look for ways to escape. And so people want to jump off the black horse onto a red horse. And that also, when you do that, then we escape it, then we don't complete that initiation, then we don't fully get grounded in our own compassion and our own humanity. And so it's just so important to stay on that black horse. And I was fortunate to have great people, including people in this room who were able to hold my hand, teach me how to ride, tell me it's okay, tell me I'd survive, including my wife and others, and we got through it. And therapy and journaling and all kinds of other things, ritual and all kinds of things that helped us, reading, poetry, to kind of stay on the black horse. So I say this because it's just important to know these stages and these parts of ourselves. And sometimes, if you're like me, it's really helpful to have some kind of an understanding of why would I go through the pain, because there really is something on the other side. Now, it's countercultural for us as Americans, because in our culture, we have this idea that happiness is the goal of life. And so people will, anything that doesn't make us happy, people will shun it. That's people will leave their marriage, leave their this, do that, leave their responsibility, leave their job if it doesn't make them happy. And so happiness, if with that as the goal, grief obviously is not a happy time. So people will, well, what can I find that will make me happy? And people will try to do anything to escape actually going through a difficult and painful experience. And yet the only way out is through. And so I wanted to say that, but I want to talk a little bit about our culture of denial here in America that really causes us to, there's nothing wrong with happiness, by the way, and the thing is that the only way to get to real happiness after grief is to ride through the grief, to learn how to grieve so that you can get to the other side where there is happiness. It doesn't mean that the pain is completely gone. It's not that it never comes back or anything like that, but it's at least you've learned through it, you've walked through it, you've felt what what you need to feel, you can survive it, and then you can move into the rest of your life. Again, it's not gone, but it doesn't dominate your life. We all know people who have not grieved well and who 20, 30 years later, you could just see it on their face, and in everything they do, you watch that their life just came apart at that moment and it never came back together. And for whatever reason, they never just were willing to ride into it and stay with it long enough to go through that. Those people were my biggest inspiration. And not to judge anybody else's process, but I would see people who 20, 30 years later who lost a child and they were just wrecked. And I thought, gosh, I don't want to be there 10 years from now. I want to, whatever I have to go through now, I want to go through so that I can be alive again and feel joy again and do all those things. And that was a great inspiration for me to do my grieving. Now, as a culture, because we have this incredible culture of denial, in America, we're not given permission, we're not encouraged to go this direction around grief, although we're learning and we're maturing around this as a culture more and more. I could talk about this from a lot of different angles. I could talk about this from our denial of climate change and the way that we hide our heads like ostriches and we go about living our lives the same as we've always lived our lives, and we don't really take seriously what we need to do. And I know our Green Team, Herb, and many others are working hard to help us to wake up to what we need to wake up to around our denial around our relationship to the environment. I could talk about this with regard to our denial about aging and our incredible sort of cult around youthfulness, and how that's such a denial of just life and death, that we are going to die, we do get old, it's part of being alive, but in our culture, we try to do everything we can to try to pretend like it's not happening. And it's a part of this culture of denial that I'm talking about. I could talk about it with regard to our relationship to the Native Americans of this land and the ways in which we've been in relationship and broken those promises and all kinds of things that we've done that we've never really had an open reckoning with, and we try to avoid, and I'm probably making some people uncomfortable even raising the issue right now. And I could talk about it with regard to, the way in which we build roads into other countries south of our border so that we could exploit the resources and the cheap labor. And then when the people in those countries turn around and follow those roads and their resources back into our country, we then deem them the criminals and ourselves the victims. This is all part of that culture of denial that we live in that harms us and harms others in our world. So today, I want to use as the example, because of everything that's going on in our country and in our world, and especially with this being the month of the anniversary of the Tulsa race riot of 1921, I want to talk a little bit about our denial of our history as it relates to racial violence. Because this is one that continues to haunt us, and it continues to be a part of our social narrative, because we've never fully been willing to face what really happened and do some of the work around truth and reconciliation and other things related to this issue. And so that's why we end up with Ferguson's and Baltimore's and Tulsa's and all these other things that we're dealing with here in 2015. So let me say a word about that. But my point is that just like personal grief, the only way out is through. It's the same with social and societal issues like this as well. So we had the Civil War, the most deadly war in this nation's history, and yet we never did any kind of work to heal the trauma of that war or the slavery that caused that war. So it was followed by 80 years of terrifying racial violence against African Americans, which included lynchings and riots like the one we had here in Tulsa, which were happening in other cities and towns across America. And we call it a riot. I think it's really important that we are careful about that. So a riot today we think of as a riot as people destroying their own community, burning down businesses and breaking windows and burning up cars. A riot, what we called a riot in the 1920s in America, was white people going in and destroying a black community, destroying their property and killing and massacring the people. So it was really more of a race massacre in today's language than it was a riot. And so that's a really important distinction. And it was happening in cities and towns across America at the time. So then there were, so we had all that going on, all kinds of trauma that was being raised. And then even in the 50s and 60s, when we then, all the way up to the 50s and 60s with the lynchings, and then when we finally passed civil rights legislation, we still never dealt with the trauma and its effects on both white and black people in this country of all those years of racial violence that began with the brutality of slavery and continued by the terrorism of communities in this country. So today, 50 years after civil rights legislation was passed, we continue to be haunted by the racial disparities in incarceration, in terms of violence in the communities, in terms of wealth, the wealth and education gap and things like that. So it all began with the systematic dehumanization of African people, slaves. It was brutal, it was very violent, and it began a system of a racial hierarchy in our country that we're still trying to unlearn today. Now, people say that we're in a post-racial society. I was just looking at a study last night that said 51% of white people answered on this study that they still carry racial prejudices against African Americans with regard to African Americans. 51%. Now, and we all know people. I know we all know people who are like that. So at the same time, it's surprising. In another way, it's not that surprising. But that's the fact. So we're not in a post-racial society. We're all still trying to unlearn this idea of a racial hierarchy. And when slavery ended, black people and black communities faced decades of terrorism. It really was, think about this, through these public lynchings. A lot of us don't know about this. I learned some things just researching this message. Did you know that over 4,000 black folks were lynched, documented having been lynched in the 80 years after slavery, 4,000, in a system of racial subordination. And what used to be called, well, as I said, the riots, the massacres that were happening, those numbers of dead are not included in the 4,000 that were lynched. Never yet, as a country, have we done any sort of real sustained truth and reconciliation efforts around this. Now, there was nothing really done for decades in this city to acknowledge, to discuss, or to address these events. Not in the schools, not in the communities, not in the churches. It just didn't happen. These lynchings and riots were tools of maintaining racial control. In many cases, this is what I learned, thousands of white people, there's pictures online, thousands of white people would come out, including children, and wear their best clothes and watch as vendors sold ice cream and lemonade. In numerous cases, black communities were forced to watch the lynching of one of their members. This was a tool of racial control that was about using killing as a public act that sent a powerful message both to African Americans and to white folks at the same time. What was the message that was sent? It was sent that African Americans are subhuman and their subjugation is therefore justified. Let me explain. The leaders of the communities were usually the ones who were doing it. And they were doing it in broad daylight, often with their children and their wives all dressed up, with vendors and concessions, and people sold postcards of pictures of the events. And there were no legal repercussions. Only 1% of the people who lynched were ever tried for doing it. So this says loud and clear to white folks and to African Americans that this is a respectable and okay thing to do. These riots and these lynchings of over 4,000 across the country inflicted a deep, traumatic, psychological wound both on the African American community but also on white people who witnessed and participated in and internalized these events, including thousands of children. Now, I know that this is very painful history to talk about. It's one of the reasons that we don't talk about it, but that's why I led in with talking about how important it is for us to stay on the horse when we get into these painful, emotionally difficult conversations. As a country, we're really good at riding the red horse. We're really good at play and adventure and risk-taking and escape. And we're pretty good at riding the white horse of community and responsibility and those kinds of things. But we still have a lot of trouble and a lot of growing up to do around what does it mean to ride the black horse of death and stay with the pain and stay with the difficult conversations in order to get through and to get onto the other side of these things. We somehow think that by hiding, maybe it'll go away. By not talking about it, maybe it will go away. But until we learn to take seriously the history of war and racial violence that is the foundation of this country, we're not going to be able to get over the events that continue to haunt us in our cities and in our community right here in Tulsa. Now, I'm proud to say that Tulsa has really been growing up around this in recent years. Thanks to leaders like Don Ross and Eddie Faye Gates and Hannibal Johnson and Julius Pegues and many others, this community has really started to grow up. We are teaching in the schools now fairly consistently the events of 1921 as I understand it. The current chief of police, Chuck Jordan, has publicly apologized for his predecessor not protecting the citizens of this nation during the riot of 1921. The former mayor, Kathy Taylor, publicly apologized to the race riot survivors who are still alive and to their descendants in a forum here in this community. We now have a park and a monument that's been there for about 7 years that memorializes the riot, but also memorializes slavery and the Trail of Tears, the John Hope Franklin Park. Also, the Historical Society of Tulsa has started to intentionally do more to include African American history as part of Tulsa's history in their displays, and also they've stopped really shying away from the events and the violence of 1921 and what they're saying. And that all starts to create some healing in this community. But we still have more storytelling and discourse to continue in this community in order to fully move through what we need to move through, including in this church and some of our own stories and some of our own history, so that we can overcome the shadow of the past and we can move into a bright future together as one city and as one community. Now, doing all this is not only for the benefit of the victims and the survivors, but it's also very much for the perpetrators as well as the witnesses who suffer as well from the trauma of systemic violence. So in my experience, as I've said, we need to experience the grief, find ways to memorialize it, find ways to talk about it, find avenues for it to be released and not hidden in order for us personally to heal, in order for us as a society to heal. It's scary, it's hard, it's sometimes counterintuitive, but we know it. We know how it works. We see how it works all the time in our own lives, and we can see how it works in certain communities. South Africa did an incredible job of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was, I know from people who participated, very healing, painful, but also very healing. And we all know people in our lives who did not do the work of grief, and it still haunts them. And as a society, we still have not done enough of the work of grieving this history in order for us to really move through it. So we continue to have Baltimore, Ferguson, Tulsa, and these events. Now imagine if more communities like All Souls began to use and apply what we know about grief, because that's a big part of what we do as religious communities. We started to use what we know about grief to help the community tell the stories, memorialize the events, and begin to free ourselves of the shame and of the heartache that continues. I mean, we still see monuments across the South to the architects of the racial hierarchy and the Confederacy. They're memorialized all over the place. There's museums. But very little do we find that is doing the work of memorializing and telling the stories of those who fought and worked and died for racial justice in this world. So imagine what could happen if we did it. Let's imagine it. And then let's put on our riding boots and giddy up. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in online. We are so pleased with all the different people who have been tuning in from all over the country and all over the world to our ministry and what we're doing at All Souls here in Tulsa. If you have a chance to send me an email or connect with me in some way, let me know what you're finding, why you tune in, and what you're getting out of it. I would love to hear from you. I'm always pleased when I get messages from different people who tell me all kinds of things about the impact of All Souls Tulsa's ministry on them and their lives and their families. And if you get a chance to make a gift to support this ministry, to become a partner, we would love to partner with you and have you be a friend of the church and somebody who is actually supporting us to create this congregation and the world that we're trying to create together. You can be a part of it, and every gift of every amount makes a difference. We really appreciate your support.